When I returned home after my parents' sudden death, I thought I was there to heal. But what happened with my stepbrother changed everything. It started with stolen glances and accidental touches, but soon, I found myself trapped in a web of emotions I couldn't escape. I never expected to feel this way about him, or to cross a line I could never uncross. I hadn't planned on returning to my childhood home. If it weren't for the accident, I probably never would have. But life has a way of dragging you back to the places you thought you'd left behind. When my parents died, I felt like my world had collapsed. The house, the land, and everything they'd built now felt like ruins, and it was up to me and my stepbrother Gabriel to pick up the pieces. Gabriel had always been the strong, silent type, the kind of man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without ever complaining. We were never particularly close growing up. He was older, more serious, and treated me more like a responsibility than a sibling. But things felt different now. The house wasn't just filled with grief, it was filled with memories, some comforting, others suffocating. Gabriel and I fell into a routine, working side by side to keep the ranch running. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it grounded me. Gabriel didn't talk much, but he didn't need to. He had this quiet presence that made me feel safe, like I wasn't completely alone. And I noticed things about him I'd never paid attention to before. The way his hands moved when he worked, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, and the way he always seemed to show up just when I needed him most. I told myself it was the grief, that we were both just looking for comfort in the middle of chaos. But the tension between us started to grow, and it was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, I stumbled upon my old school uniform. On a whim, I tried it on, laughing at how tight it felt now compared to back then. But when I walked downstairs and Gabriel saw me, the laughter died in my throat. His eyes lingered, longer than they should have. And for the first time, I saw something in his expression that both terrified and excited me. That moment should have been my wake-up call, but instead, it was the beginning of something I couldn't stop. Rising tension and suspicion, 600 words. After that moment in the kitchen, everything shifted. Gabriel and I tried to pretend it hadn't happened, that we were still just two grieving siblings trying to keep the ranch afloat. But the tension lingered, thick and heavy, hanging in the air every time we were in the same room. I started to notice the little things. How he'd find excuses to touch my hand when passing tools or brush against me when squeezing by in the hallway. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into innocent moments. But then there were the looks. I'd catch him watching me, his gaze steady and intense like he was seeing me for the first time. And when I looked back, he wouldn't look away. Instead, he'd hold my stare until my stomach twisted in knots and my heart pounded so hard I thought he might hear it. One night, while we were finishing up chores in the barn, the tension finally cracked. We were stacking hay bales, the air thick with dust and sweat. I was struggling to lift one, my arms trembling from exhaustion, when Gabriel stepped in behind me. "Here," he said, his voice low as he reached around me to grab the bale. His chest pressed against my back, and I froze, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was. I expected him to pull away quickly, but he didn't. Instead, his hands lingered on mine, and for a moment we just stood there, neither of us moving. "Gabriel," my voice came out barely above a whisper, shaky and uncertain. "Do you feel it too?" he asked, his breath warm against my neck. I turned to face him, but before I could answer, he stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Forget it," he muttered, turning away as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget. The following days were a blur of stolen glances and lingering touches. Every interaction felt like it was balanced on the edge of something dangerous, like one wrong move would send us both tumbling over. One evening, I caught him watching me again as I stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes. The way his eyes traveled down my body made my breath catch, and suddenly, I couldn't take it anymore. I spun around to face him. "Gabriel, what's happening between us?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might walk away. But then he stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "You know what's happening," he said, his voice low and steady. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but I couldn't. Because deep down I knew he was right. "I can't," I whispered, but even as I said it, I didn't move away. Gabriel reached out, his fingers brushing my cheek, and I felt myself leaning into his touch. "You can," he said. "And I think you want to." I hated how much I wanted it to be true. That night I lay awake in bed, replaying every word, every touch, every glance. I knew this was wrong, that we were crossing lines we couldn't come back from, but part of me didn't care. because for the first time in years I felt wanted. And that terrified me. I tried to avoid him after that night. I told myself I needed space, that if I stayed away long enough, the feelings would fade. But the more I avoided Gabriel, the stronger the pull became. Days turned into restless nights. I'd lie awake, my mind replaying every glance, every accidental touch. No matter how hard I tried to focus on chores or keep my thoughts occupied, I kept coming back to him. The way his voice dropped when he spoke to me, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long. Then it happened again. I was in the barn brushing one of the horses when I heard Gabriel's footsteps behind me. My pulse quickened immediately, but I kept my back turned, pretending not to notice. "You've been avoiding me," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach twist. "I haven't," I lied, focusing on the rhythmic strokes of the brush. Gabriel stepped closer, his presence like heat against my back. "Don't do that," he said softly. "Don't pretend this isn't happening." I froze, my breath catching. He was so close I could feel his warmth, smell the faint scent of sweat and earth on his skin. "Gabriel, we can't." He cut me off by placing his hand gently on my arm, turning me to face him. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "You don't really believe that," he said. I tried to protest, to say something that would stop this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, my gaze dropped to his lips, and before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were testing the waters. But it didn't take long for the hesitation to melt away. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I let him. Every nerve in my body lit up at his touch. It wasn't just the heat or the chemistry. It was the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world. But as quickly as it started, it ended. Gabriel pulled back, his breathing heavy. "We shouldn't be doing this," he said, but his hands didn't let go. "I know," I whispered, even as I leaned back into him. We didn't stop. The rest of the night was a blur. Soft touches, whispered confessions, and kisses that left me breathless. By the time it was over, I lay tangled in his arms, my heart pounding and my mind racing. But as reality set in, so did the guilt. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel brushed his fingers through my hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I don't want it to stop." Neither did I. In the days that followed, we tried to keep things quiet, sneaking moments when we thought no one would notice. But it was impossible to hide what was happening. The tension between us was palpable, and I caught myself looking over my shoulder more than once, afraid that someone might see us. One evening, Gabriel pulled me aside after dinner. "We can't keep pretending," he said, his voice low. "I know," I replied, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The truth was, part of me didn't want to stop. For the first time in years, I felt alive, wanted, desired. But another part of me knew we were playing with fire, and it was only a matter of time before we got burned. And that's exactly what happened. One night, I walked into the kitchen and found Gabriel already there. He didn't say a word, just pulled me into his arms and kissed me like he'd been waiting all day to do it. I didn't resist. But we weren't alone. The sound of the front door opening made us spring apart, but it was too late. Gabriel's cousin, Adrian, stood in the doorway, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. I'll never forget the look on his face, the shock, the disappointment, and something else I couldn't quite place. And in that moment, I knew everything was about to fall apart. The moment Adrian's eyes locked with mine, I knew there was no undoing what he'd seen. His expression shifted from shock to something darker, disgust, maybe, or disbelief. I couldn't tell. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I barely heard the sound of Gabriel stepping back, putting distance between us. "Adrian," Gabriel started, his voice tight, but Adrian held up a hand to cut him off. "Don't," Adrian snapped. "Don't try to explain this." I opened my mouth to speak, to try to justify the unjustifiable, but no words came out. Instead, Adrian's gaze shifted to me, and the disappointment in his eyes made my stomach churn. "How long?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Adrian, it's not what you think," Gabriel said quickly, but even as he said it, we all knew it was a lie. Adrian let out a bitter laugh. "Not what I think. Are you kidding me? I just saw it with my own eyes." The room felt suffocating. I wanted to run, to disappear, to take it all back, but it was too late. "I trusted you," Adrian said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Both of you." "Adrian, please," I finally managed to say, stepping forward, but he recoiled like I'd burned him. "Don't," he said again, this time softer, almost broken. "I need to get out of here." And then he left. The sound of the door slamming shut felt like the crack of thunder, and the silence that followed was deafening. Gabriel turned to me, his face pale. "We have to fix this," he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "How?" I asked, tears burning in my eyes. "How do we fix this?" We didn't have an answer. The days that followed were unbearable. Adrian didn't come back to the ranch, and he wouldn't answer our calls. Gabriel threw himself into work, avoiding me at every turn, while I felt like I was drowning under the weight of what we'd done. The guilt was crushing. But it wasn't just guilt, it was fear. Fear of what would happen if Adrian told someone. Fear of what people would say if they found out. Fear of losing everything. I started losing sleep, haunted by nightmares of Gabriel walking away, of Adrian exposing our secret, of my entire life falling apart. And the worst part, I couldn't stop thinking about Gabriel. Even after everything, I still wanted him. One night, unable to take the silence anymore, I found him in the barn. He was working late, his shirt damp with sweat and dirt smeared across his hands. "Gabriel," I said, my voice trembling. He looked up, and for a moment, there was something in his eyes, something soft, something vulnerable. But then it was gone, replaced by that same guarded expression he'd been wearing since Adrian left. "We need to talk," I said. "There's nothing to talk about," he replied, turning back to his work. I stepped closer. "Don't shut me out." He paused, his shoulders tense. "I'm not shutting you out. I'm trying to protect you." "From what?" "From this," he said, finally turning to face me. "From what we've done. From what it's going to cost us." I swallowed hard. "I don't care about the cost." "Well, I do," he snapped, his voice breaking. "Because it's not just about us anymore. Adrian knows. And it's only a matter of time before everyone else does too." I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Then let them." Gabriel stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you serious? Do you even hear yourself? This isn't some fairy tale where everything works out in the end. This is real life, and real life doesn't work that way." "Maybe not," I said softly. "But I know what I feel. And I know you feel it too." He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said everything. Without thinking, I reached for him, and this time he didn't pull away. His arms wrapped around me, and the moment our lips met, all the fear and guilt melted away. If only for a moment. But the moment didn't last. Because the next thing I knew, Adrian was standing in the doorway, his face twisted with anger. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. We jumped apart, but it was too late. Gabriel started, but Adrian cut him off. "No, I don't want to hear it." He turned to me, his voice trembling. "You're unbelievable. I trusted you." Tears welled in my eyes. "Adrian, please." But he was already shaking his head. "You think you can just sweep this under the rug? Pretend it didn't happen?" "We're not pretending," Gabriel said, stepping in front of me. Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Then you're even more pathetic than I thought." And with that, he turned and walked away again. But this time, I knew he wasn't coming back. I sank to the floor, my legs giving out beneath me. Gabriel knelt beside me, his arms wrapping around me, but the comfort felt hollow. Because no matter how much I wanted to believe we could fix this, deep down, I knew the truth. We'd crossed a line we could never uncross. Adrian's footsteps echoed in my ears long after he was gone. The slamming door felt like a final judgment. A reminder that the secret we'd tried so hard to contain had shattered, spilling out into the world where we couldn't control it anymore. I stayed in Gabriel's arms for what felt like hours, my body trembling and my mind racing. Neither of us spoke. What could we possibly say? When I finally pulled away, Gabriel looked at me with a mix of sadness and determination. "We'll figure this out," he said, but the words felt empty. I didn't believe him. The next morning, I woke up to an unbearable sense of dread. Gabriel was already gone, out in the fields, avoiding me, avoiding the house. And Adrian was nowhere to be found. I checked my phone for the 100th time, but there were no calls, no messages. The guilt hit me harder than ever. I tried to keep busy, throwing myself into chores around the house and ranch, but nothing could quiet the storm inside me. Every time I passed the kitchen or the barn, I thought about the moments that had led us here, the touches, the kisses, the whispered confessions. I hated myself for wanting more of it, even now. But the silence didn't last. That afternoon, Gabriel came back, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists. "He told someone," Gabriel said, his voice tight. I froze. "What?" "Adrian. He told someone. I don't know who, but people are talking." My heart sank. "What are they saying?" He shook his head. "I don't know yet. But it's bad." Panic surged through me. The thought of our secret spreading through the town, of whispers behind my back, of people looking at me with judgment and disgust, I couldn't breathe. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Gabriel ran a hand through his hair, his frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. I don't know. I don't know how to fix this. The fear turned to anger. He had no right. Gabriel's eyes snapped to mine. He had every right. We did this. We crossed the line. And now we have to deal with it. The weight of his words settled over me like a stone. He was right. We'd done this. We'd let it happen, and now we were paying the price. The fallout was swift. By the end of the week, the rumors had spread. People in town started giving me looks, pitying glances from women I used to call friends, and judgmental stares from strangers. Gabriel was dealing with it too. He came home angrier every day, his shoulders tense and his words clipped. He was fighting battles I couldn't see, but I could feel them wearing him down. And between us, the tension grew. We stopped talking about what had happened. The silence between us became unbearable, but neither of us knew how to break it. One night, after another long day of avoiding each other, Gabriel finally snapped. "This isn't working," he said, slamming a cup down on the kitchen counter. I flinched. "What do you mean?" "This," he shouted, gesturing between us. "Pretending like we can just move past this. Like it's not tearing us apart." Tears welled in my eyes. "So what are you saying? That we should pretend it never happened?" "I'm saying maybe it shouldn't have happened," he said, his voice breaking. His words hit me harder than I expected. I knew he was scared. I was scared too, but hearing him say it out loud felt like a knife to the chest. "So that's it," I whispered. "You regret it?" He didn't answer right away, and that silence said more than words ever could. I turned and walked away, slamming the door behind me. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. Maybe it shouldn't have happened. Maybe we'd let our grief and loneliness push us into something we weren't ready for. But that didn't change the fact that it had happened. And now we had to live with it. The next morning, I found Gabriel packing a bag. "I need some time," he said, his voice softer now. "To think. To figure out what comes next." I wanted to beg him to stay, but I didn't. Instead, I just nodded and watched him walk out the door. And then I was alone. The house felt hollow without him. Every room was a reminder of what we'd shared, and what we'd lost. I spent the next few days in a daze, replaying everything that had led us here and wondering if I could have stopped it. But deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't something I could fix overnight. Gabriel and I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. All I could do now was face the consequences, and hope that someday I could forgive myself. The silence in the house was unbearable after Gabriel left. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, felt like a reminder of what I'd lost. Not just Gabriel, but the version of myself I thought I knew. I spent hours replaying everything in my mind, hoping to make sense of it all. How had we let it happen? How had we crossed so many lines without realizing we were falling? But the truth was I had realized it. I'd felt it in every lingering glance, every stolen touch, and every moment I let myself believe that what we had was more than a mistake. And maybe it was more. That was the thought I couldn't let go of, no matter how much I tried. Because as much as I hated myself for what I'd done, I couldn't forget how Gabriel made me feel. Alive, seen, wanted. But feelings didn't erase consequences. And the consequences of our actions were already spreading like wildfire. Adrian hadn't come back, but his absence was louder than words. The rumors in town continued to grow, and every time I stepped into the market or walked through the feed store, I felt the stares. I heard the whispers. "Did you hear about her and Gabriel? It's disgusting. How could they?" I wanted to scream at them, to tell them they didn't know the full story. But what could I say? That we were grieving? That we were lonely? That it just happened? None of it would ever be enough. So instead, I let the rumors wash over me, punishing myself with every look and every word because I thought I deserved it. But time passed, and with it, the weight of the scandal began to fade. The stares became less frequent. The whispers grew quieter. And slowly I started to rebuild. I focused on the ranch, throwing myself into the work. I fixed fences, fed horses, and did everything I could to keep my hands busy, so my mind wouldn't wander. It helped, but it didn't erase Gabriel. I thought about him every day, wondering where he was, if he was okay, if he ever thought about me. I thought about calling him more times than I could count, but I never picked up the phone. I knew we couldn't go back. But I also knew I couldn't keep running from what happened. So I started therapy, hoping it would help me untangle the mess I'd made. And for the first time, I let myself admit the truth, not just to my therapist but to myself. I hadn't betrayed my marriage because I was in love. I'd done it because I was lost, because I was lonely, because I was desperate to feel something, anything, that reminded me I was alive. And Gabriel? He wasn't the villain. He was just as lost as I was. We had both been searching for something we couldn't find in ourselves, and in doing so, we broke something we couldn't fix. But we weren't bad people. That was the hardest part to accept, that two good people could make such a terrible mistake. It took months, but eventually, the guilt began to loosen its grip on me. I learned to forgive myself, not completely, but enough to move forward. I stopped hiding from the world and started letting people back in. I rebuilt my friendships, and I allowed myself to dream about a future where I didn't define myself by my worst decisions. And Gabriel? I heard from him once, a short, awkward phone call months after he left. He sounded better, stronger. He apologized, but I told him he didn't need to. We were both trying to heal, and maybe that meant letting go of each other. I don't know if I'll ever see him again, but I do know this: I won't make the same mistake twice. Because love isn't just passion and chemistry. It's trust, boundaries, and honesty. And without those things, even the strongest connection will fall apart. So if you're ever standing at the edge of temptation, ask yourself, is this worth losing everything you've built? Because I asked myself too late. What would you have done in her place? Was it love, desperation, or just a moment of weakness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your side of the story. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking and emotional stories like this one. Trust me, the next one will leave you speechless. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. Let me know if you need any revisions or edits.